welcome everybody back to another episode of Rooftop Psychology, where we take your unconscious mind out of cruise control and put your conscious mind into overdrive. We're going to look at something a little interesting today, sort of some psychology experiments that were done in university setting, as well as some social conformity experiments that were done with hidden cameras, and kind of get a consensus on how do we act in a group setting, basis may we act as an individual. We're going to start off pretty deep, pretty heavy with this first experiment. Hang in there. We're going to work through a couple, and the last one is literally labeled the hope experiment. So hang in there for the hope. The first experiment we're going to go over is the milligram experiment. It was an obedience to authority figures experiment. It was conducted at Yale University by the psychologist Stanley Milgram. This experiment was basically, in essence, to see if you were instructed authoritarian figure, would you push past the limit of what you would normally, rationally, morally do or not? So the Milgram experiment, he wrote a book in 1974 called The Obedience to Authority and Experimental View. The experiment was actually started in July of 1961, and it was to basis the idea of what happened during the Nazi regime in Germany. It was to get the understanding is, could regular people just doing a job be instructed to do heinous things to other individuals because they came from a place of authority? This was the basis hypothesis of the experiment. I'm going to go ahead and read to you what his basic overall consensus was, and then we'll kind of dive into a little bit of the detail. The summary was, the legal and philosophic aspects of obedience are an enormous importance, but they say very little about how most people behave in concrete situations. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to or by experimental scientists. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victim, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go almost to any length on the command of authority constitutes the chief finding of the study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation. Ordinary people simply doing their job and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear, and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people had the resources needed to resist authority. This is an absolutely unbelievable finding and kind of sheds some light on the idea of the Nazi regime, right? We kind of look and go, how did this get so far? Some of the results here are looking at a 65% shock rate. So what ended up happening was you'd have an authoritarian figure instructing another individual to shock somebody else on the other side of the wall. And of course, these shocks were fake, but the person on the other side of the wall who was in on it would scream and make noises, symbolizing, resembling actually being shocked. In Milgram's first set of experiments, 65% of experiment patients administered the experiment's final massive 450 volt shock, which is enough to kill somebody, and all administered shocks of at least 300 volts. Absolutely unbelievable. And he found that if you just prodded them in these four simple rates, you could get them to continue pushing past what they were comfortable doing. Number one, please continue or please go on, he would say. Number two, the experiment requires that you continue. Number three, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And last, you have no other choice. You must go on. This is an absolutely shocking experiment to realize just how far what we consider a normal person be pushed based to the fact that they're being instructed to do so, they feel it's part of their job, and, well, it's quote-unquote the right thing to do. They have no other option to leave. We're going to leave that one. That's an extremely bitter in the mouth taste, but it kind of gives you a little bit of an understanding maybe of how the Nazi regime came to such destruction. The next one we're going to talk about is two social experiments. One was from Jennifer Wozmek, a psychology instructor at Bethany Lutheran College, And the experiment was to sort of get the idea of social conformity is everywhere. The clothes we wear, the rules we follow, those social roles we play. The experiment was in such. They had a candid camera inside of an elevator. Usually when people go into an elevator, they walk in, they turn around, they face the same way they entered the elevator. They click their button to wherever they're going, and they exit. The experiment was to basically see that if you already had the elevator pre-stacked with people facing the opposite direction, when a subject came into the elevator, would they follow suit and face backwards in the elevator what they consider to be normal? And it turned out that yes, absolutely. A subject would enter into the elevator, they wouldn't face the normal direction, and they'd face standing backwards in the elevator, how they've entered the elevator every other single time in their life. Incredible, right? It just seems like, well, wow, I can't believe that would even happen, right? And it's just these social conformity pressures that people get, right? The fear of being left out or the odd man out or looking different makes you do things you would not normally do. And they found that the more they had put people into the elevator, so if instead of just having one person in the elevator when a subject would come in, they had maybe 5 or 6 in the elevator, it was easier to sway that individual consistently more often to face backwards in the elevator. The result came of, to this degree, the youngest conform most often, more than 40% of the time, while the oldest are least likely to conform between 14 and 24% of the time, depending on if they're a middle-aged adult or lady and adult, respectively. So that kind of gives you an idea, like probably where the saying comes from, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? It's just a long pattern of habit, less likely to conform. The next social experiment was done in an office, coming in to do an eye exam, and everybody else was in on it. So in the waiting room had 10 to 12 people sitting down in chairs, and they let this tone out. Well, every time they'd hear this beeping sound, everybody would stand up. Well, of course, she didn't stand up the first time. She didn't stand up the second time, but on the third time, she conforms to what is perceived the normal operating of this office, where if she hears the tone, everybody stands. They slowly pulled one individual out at a time who was part of it until the entire room was filled with new subjects who had no idea why they were doing what they were doing, and they were asked, "Why are you standing up?" Nobody could answer it because there was a whole new set of subjects that had rolled through there. It was just what you did. That's a pretty staggering amount to nobody even asking the question, why are we doing this? This isn't normal, right? And it seems silly, but this was done for a National Geographic set from the Brain Games. And it's just an interesting social experiment to decide, will people act differently based in a group setting? And it does seem that people will do social conformity. Social conformity is defined as a specific type of influence that results in a change of behavior or a belief in order to fit in with the group. It seems to be obviously relevant that social conformity plays a huge part in our society. Roughly 90% of kids in high school attempt to conform with some sort of social standard, right? It's just a norm. We got 2 more here, one of which being the hope. The next one here we have a study of rats. And this was done by Dr. Jacques Psek. Hopefully I didn't butcher his name too bad. He was a neuroscientist who studied the role play in rats. And what he found was when larger rats would not let smaller rats win, once in a while, which deemed about 30% of the time, the smaller rats would stop playing with them. It's just the small rat obviously feels too much defeat, not enough hope, no chance of winning. Well, now they both lose out because the small rat doesn't want to play. The big rat no longer has a playmate as well. So deep ingrained underneath the idea of this cortex of play, it's actually done at a primitive level because he actually removed the cortexes of the rats to see if they still wanted to roughhouse with other rats. And they did. So to his study, it actually confirmed that this was more primitive and in a more primitive part of the brain than just the cortexes. This also includes mammals as well as humans. We operate the same way. There was a point in time where me and my wife owned a gym and I programmed for class settings, right? Your 10 to 15, 20 person class group settings. And everybody did the same workout day in and day out as the rest of their fellow class. I would program workouts to ensure the same principle applied, that 30% of the time, everybody seemed to be on the same playing field. Everybody would finish at the same time. Nobody felt they were left out, left behind, because obviously we're all at different skill levels, skill set, strength, as we all normally are. Nothing is created equal. But I ensured that our programming, when I did it, basically gave this same psychology to the 30% winning. That way your people who are new people who need to lose weight, people who had a problem with eating, all sorts of aspects of why someone would fall down in the bottom end of the spectrum, they felt those victories. And because they felt those victories, they could commit to a longer period of time inside the gym. And because they committed to a longer period of time, the results were beneficial. They achieved their goals because they just spent simply more time trying to get them. And that was the idea behind my programming psychology, was keep them coming back to the gym. And this was one huge aspect of how I would program the workouts. Let's end on the last one. This one was absolutely astonishing to me that this was the case. I was absolutely blown away that this study and thesis actually came out with this result. There was a Harvard study done in the 1950s by Dr. Kurt Richer, where he would place rats in a pool of water to test how long they could tread water for. And he concluded that on average, they'd give up after about 15 minutes and sink to the bottom. This is where the experiment gets interesting. What he would do right before they would give up to exhaustion, that was it. They gave up. They're going to hit the bottom. They're going to drown. The researchers would pull them out of the beakers of water, dry them off, and let them rest for a few minutes. Now remember, he had them in there for about 15 minutes. They swam with what all they could think until they gave up. So 15 minutes of time swimming around, treading until that's it, I'm too tired. Researchers pull them out, dry them off for a few minutes, give them rest for a few minutes, put them back in for a second round. This is absolutely unbelievable. You could take a guess on how long you think that the rats would swim a second time, right? So they swam for 50 minutes the first time, gave them a few minutes of rest, go back in. You think, well, it can't surely be as long a duration as the first time. They're more tired. They've exhausted more resource, right? So you kind of think about maybe 10 minutes or maybe 5 minutes. No, not at all. These rats, after given a short break, coming back from exhaustion to which they were willing to give up, swam for 60 hours. Yes, we're not talking minutes. We're talking an accumulation of hours that lasted days. And he concluded that since the rats believed that they would eventually be rescued and they wouldn't drown, they pushed their bodies past the previous impossible. They were given hope. So think about that in the idea of the human species. How much can we endure when we have hope? How much have people in unjust situations, going back to kind of the first experiment with Milgram, the Nazi German concentration camps, individuals in there basically being starved to death. The ones that survived had hope. And with just a little bit of hope, what are human beings capable of? What can we believe in when you have hope? It's sort of the idea of the space race, making it to the moon. Hope is such a vital impact on our psychology that once you lose hope, it appears that you lose everything. So if you take something from this today, as the saying goes, things can always get worse. Try to focus on the positive. Try and find a hope, a reason to push forward, trudge through your day, no matter how bad it may seem. It's always a short amount of time, and there is light at the end of the tunnel. Hang on to hope. I hope you guys enjoyed going through a few of those experiments and how social conformity seems to be extremely relevant in our society and how it plays a part in how we move. Enjoyed that episode of Rooftop Psychology, and I will see y'all on the next one.